Marriage Podcast. I'm Heather Choate, live with Mark Johnston. How are you doing, Mark?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you doing?
Doing great. Today, we're talking about a marriage miracle and transforming your relationship from pain to joy. Now, I understand anytime anyone uses the word miracle, that's a bit of a buzzword, right? We need to be careful of what we're talking about. However, for Mark and I, what we're about to share with you just seems like our normal everyday lives, right, Mark? But for many of our clients, it truly does feel like they've turned the odds and that they just solved this huge undertaking. It may have felt hopeless to turn their marriage around. So if you're feeling like it's hopeless and you need a miracle, this process that we're going to share with you is going to be for you. But before we get to that, I'm going to share our client win of the week. This one came from one of our brand new group coaching members here. And they say, posting a win. Disclosure, I'm doing a beta group thing through here. I texted hubby a home message about being supportive and requesting respectful communication back. He replied back with, "We'll try to be easier with my words and explaining things." Later in the day, he texted, "Good news for you, but I want to tell you in person." It was indeed good news. We've been separated for 1.5 years, and he doesn't always come over. Today, my stepson requested to come over and ride the quad, play with my oldest son, etc. Coming here in person to tell me something and bringing my stepson along is a pretty huge thing. Plus, he agreed to try and be more respectful versus dictating things with me. So right off the bat, she is going from, separation for 1.5 years and really requesting that their communication be supportive and more respectful. And he's responding. So Mark, what do you think is going on here and why is this such a win?
Well, I've spoken with this person. I actually know who this is, even though the name was redacted there. There's a lot going on, but the gist of it is that there needed to be some very clear direction, I think, with where this was going. And that's something that was lacking in the situation. It needed a nudge in the right direction. And when this person started taking some very healthy actions, it became a lot easier to start making some requests and start to get her husband's involvement in some of the healing process. And when she did that appropriately, he was very receptive to it. So what I'm getting at here is I don't want to take, 100% of the credit here by any means. Of course, this person did a lot of work, and there had been other work leading up to their involvement with our program. But that's the thing, is a lot of cases aren't quite doing things quite right, and they just need some little nudges to get it really rolling along quite a bit better. I'm glad that this person's husband was being a lot more receptive here.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that we look for, is to help you guys get some quick wins. Because like you mentioned there, Mark, sometimes it's just adjusting things a few degrees. Maybe you're getting, 60% of it okay-ish, maybe 10% really good. But then the rest, if we just tweak that a little bit, when you start doing new things, then you'll start to get some new results. And it's really encouraging once you start to see that. So as you guys are watching us live and in the replay, leave a comment and let me know where your marriage is at right now. On a scale of 1 to 10, do you feel like it is healthy and thriving? 10 being healthy and thriving, 1 being on the brink of divorce, or anywhere in between there. And then also let us know in the comments, on a scale of 1 to 10, how committed are you to creating a happy relationship and turning this relationship around if it's not where you want it to be? So let us know where things are at right now, how you would rate your relationship, and how would you rate your level of commitment to getting there? Because commitment is going to be something we're talking about, because transforming your relationship around from something that's like really painful right now, on the rocks, on the verge of divorce right now, to a source of happiness and joy and fulfillment is going to be a process. So it's definitely going to take some commitment to getting there. So today we want to break things down into the main steps and what it takes to turn things around. Now, Mark and I, we've helped thousands of clients now with their relationships. And I'm really excited because we're putting together a new process that we're using with some of our beta coaching program, our clients here, but it goes really well with our foundational PATH method as well. So if you aren't familiar with PATH, I want to let you guys know right off the bat, we are opening doors on that course for 3 days only. 3 days only. We've had it actually shut for over a year, and we're opening doors on that course. So if you want to get in, it's 90% off during the next 3 days, and we're only opening it up to 100 people. So I'm doing a direct plug here. If you want to get the course, just leave a comment and say PATH. We've already had a number of people join just since yesterday, but we do have some spots open, but they will go very fast. So if you want to get in on that course and know what these 4 foundational pieces are to turn your marriage around, leave a comment and say PATH, and I will send you the link so that you can get in before doors are closed. If you're watching this later, doors will be closed. We're not going to open them again, and we're going to be shifting things into this newer process. So encourage you guys to act quickly before that's gone. All right, Mark. So what are some of the things that we found helping so many couples turn what might seem like a hopeless situation into something that is salvageable into turning their marriage around?
So some things that we've noticed is that a lot of people, they start trying to jump into a lot of the solutions before they're ready. I would say like that's the vast majority of people. They say, okay, my marriage is in crisis. I better do something here, and we've talked about this on occasion here, Heather, and they'll jump into things like, okay, I'm going to get my partner some flowers or some gifts. They might send a letter of apology. They might make some personal changes, some deep conversations. All these things are like, they're good. These are good things within most any relationship. The problem is that it might not be effective depending on what the problem is. And so like a lot of what we're trying to do with systematizing this a little or changing the system up a little bit is trying to get people on the right track and make sure that no matter what's going on here, that they're headed in a right direction. And that's like today we're not even really talking a whole lot about the system, but it is loosely related to what Heather was mentioning earlier. And I think like a good place to start in terms of like broad steps, if we're talking about how do we go from a really painful relationship to something that's really happy and healthy, is we do need to start and we need to hit certain areas. I do think that first area is that area of understanding or assessment. And it started to fit. I'm going to admit here, as I was writing this out, I was like, it was starting to fit some alliteration. So I was like, I'm just going to force it a little bit. So we have some 4 areas that I do think that are needed to really go from that really unhealthy place to a really happy and joyous space. And that's assessment, application, assurance, and accountability. I mean, like I said, yeah, 4 A's. Yeah. These are more broad steps and certainly a lot of details, a lot of things that need to be done within each. But I thought that would be a good place to start this conversation. And like I said, rather than getting people to go just jump into some sort of solution that might be ineffective and cause people to lose some hope because it's just not the right thing, I do think that first place to start is that assessment and that understanding. So, Heather, what do we really do with these beginning stages? Like, why is that understanding, why do you think that's so important in beginning the process there, especially when a marriage is more in that crisis, at that crisis point?
Yeah. So for me, when my marriage has been, in hard times and struggling, you just lose a lot of perspective on what's really going on. You tend to just see through your own pain and through your own fear. And I talk to a lot of people, especially in the master classes that we run a couple times a month, that, we go into that fight, flight, or freeze mode. We're afraid of our partner leaving, and that just tends to cloud all of our understanding and viewpoint of the situation. And we tend to react in very instinctual ways, right? That fear-based place where we tend to demand, beg, plead, manipulate, withdraw ourselves, freeze. And sometimes we start just trying to apply solutions, like you talked about, right? Like we get into this, like, I'm going to fight for my marriage, but it's still from this place of just fear. It's out of desperation. And we don't even know if that's the right thing to do. Maybe your therapist told you, and maybe they're very well-meaning, but maybe they don't really know the real issue going on. Or maybe you took advice from your friends or family, or you're just trying to do whatever you think you can, and you don't have that clarity on what the real issue is, right? So we need to get past the instinct of fear and self-protection mode, where you're like, I want this person to come back to me so I can feel safe. I want them to stop pulling away so I can feel secure. And we need to actually look at what's going on with clarity. And that's very challenging to do when you're in it. Okay. We do have some questions that you can ask and try to take like a 30,000 foot view so that you're outside your own pain, even try to get outside your perspective. One of the things that I do is I'm always like, is there another way of looking at this? That's something I've learned over the years to do for my own mentor. Like, is there another way of looking at this? Is the story that I'm telling about this, my husband, the situation, the affair, whatever it might be, is that story the only truth that there could be? Right? It may feel true to you, but the reality is that there's probably many different ways that you could look at the situation. And I'm going to put in another plug here, but this is what we do, is we help you uncover what's really going on in the relationship. So you're not left to fend for yourself, right? You're not left to that fear-based instinctual response that we go to. We help you read the label on your bottle. You guys might have heard, but you can't read the label when you're inside the bottle, right? You're just so close to it. You can't see it for what it is. So we read the label on your bottle, we diagnose what's really going on, and then we prescribe the right treatment plan. So we are going to offer here, though, some questions you can begin to ask yourselves to get that understanding, because like it is vital that you solve what is actually the real problem and you solve it with the right solution. Mm-hmm. Agreed? Do you guys agree? I mean, who here has put on the wrong Band-Aid, right? Who here has like applied the wrong solution? Who's done the flowers and the gifts, or maybe over apologizing, right? You working on yourself, making all these changes, right? Trying to resolve issues in the relationship, and it just falls flat, or maybe even backfires and makes things worse. Leave a comment, let me know if you feel like you've made one of those mistakes, because I know most people are making those mistakes and I've made them too.
So yeah, like you said, some questions that I think would be good to ask. The who, what, when, where, why, I think is really good, but I'm going to ask them out of order here. But like, when did all this begin? It's good to know what was really happening around when things started to fall apart. Usually, in my experience, those moments where everything started to kind of come apart or get worse really give us a lot of good information as to what is going wrong. It's a reminder of something that's been building up over some time. But there's a lot of significance in those sort of things. Next question you might want to consider is, why is the relationship in such a state? Might seem obvious, but you really need to understand, instead of like just jumping in with solutions, why did things start falling apart? Why would your partner even consider divorce? And unless you actually understand things, like Heather said, from their perspective, it's not going to really be much use. And third one, which I actually think is the most important one, is what prevented this from resolving on its own. Heather and I sometimes talk about, getting to the root problems. And I think this is very much a question that starts to tackle that, because most relationships, if they're going to be healthy, there are some things within the relationship that help you just naturally resolve problems, whether that's like regular discussion or very open, intimate conversations. Maybe that's someone really is intuitive and takes action to resolve things, but something prevented the relationship from healing at some point. Otherwise, the relationship wouldn't be in crisis. And so by examining those blocks that typically allow for healing to happen, like what are those blocks, and resolving them, you can much better get at the root cause and actually bring about real healing. Then further, like it's good to consider, okay, like how are we actually going to be making things better? If you understand what's wrong, rather than just jumping in, like, once again, don't just go buy flowers, don't just go buy gifts. How would, if you're going to do that, how would that actually resolve the problems here? You need the solutions to be related to the problems. And I know that might seem obvious to many people, but to some it's not. And I do get people coming in, they're like, well, I've tried everything. I've tried like buying her a new car, and I've tried, taking over all the household chores, and okay, does that actually resolve the concerns? And they're like, oh, I guess not. And then very clearly, like, who is going to do what, like, as in what's actually going to happen and whose responsibility is what. And in these beginning stages, often it is the partner who is more interested in, resolving the crisis. But it's good to know, like, what are you actually going to do, or, like, whose responsibility is what here.
Love that. So go ahead and take some time and answer each one of these questions. And if you want to, you can put them in the chat because we respond to every comment that we get. But when did this all begin? For some of you might be like, I'm blindsided. I didn't know that they were unhappy. They said that they've been unhappy for years. Okay, well then it began years ago. You have to respect that that's what your partner's saying. So that's what the underlying, thing that led up to where things are at. Right. And what were some of those initial divisions between you? What kind of caused you to lose connection? A lot of times this is when they may have made a bid for connection. It was met with some level of rejection, and that tends to build up over time, or underlying issues or trauma. Right. And then I really love your question there. How are we going to make things better? Right. Mm-hmm. And so making sure that we apply the right solution to the right problem. That one is vital. We don't want to do things out of order because that's going to backfire. And one of the biggest mistakes that you can make is pushing for connection or commitment too soon. Sometimes one of the best things that you can do to make things better is to kind of back off and take the pressure off the relationship, stop talking about the relationship, stop pushing them to work on the relationship. All of those things is really important, so that then you can build up some stability in the relationship so you can handle having those conversations at the appropriate time. So love to see your answers about that. I see some coming in. I see some people weighing in on the status of their relationship right now. And that is going to be really important to help get you clarity. And again, this is usually best done with some professional guidance because we're so close to it. It's really challenging to see and understand clearly what's going on. So leave a comment and say breakthrough if you want a completely free breakthrough session with us, where we do that deep root analysis of your marriage. We determine what's actually going on and what you need to do at this exact moment to help your relationship turn around. Oftentimes, for most of you, it's going to be going a little slower so that then eventually you can go fast. Taking the pressure off, it's increasing understanding, it's putting in healthy boundaries if needed, and it's finding what you can communicate about and what you can connect about that is going to be received by your partner at this stage. So then you can start to deepen that as it goes through the process. All right, so we've got assessment. Awesome. Next is application. All right, application. So Mark, marriages in crisis, right? They usually have one thing in common. What is that?
There's usually like a lack of trust in change or the ability to heal. And why I, like we're saying this right here, I think, at least why I would say this, is if there was hope in change, if there was trust and that things could be better or would be different, I would say that most relationships wouldn't be in crisis. If you're saying, okay, things could be better, I trust that things could be better, you wouldn't be heading down a path where divorce is a consideration. Most people wouldn't. So I do think like this application part of this that you mentioned here, Heather, it's just that part of where we are beginning to that process where we are creating some amount of trust. I think a lot of it's the it's about taking action, creating that change, but I don't think we're going to be building up a whole lot of trust right at the beginning. It's just kind of setting the stage for that, in my opinion. So, Heather, like we're saying here with application, making some changes, it is needed. But I think most people understand that. And we've been talking a little bit about here, like, hey, don't just jump in and make some changes. So like, what's the difference here between just going in and changing and doing so effectively?
Right. So one of the things that's really important, because we agree that change is needed, right, is that we need to have some communication, some understanding, and some follow through. Otherwise, making those changes is just not very effective, because either your partner isn't going to notice or they're not really going to care. And I don't know if this is where you meant to go with this, but what's bringing to my mind is kind of home messages, right, that you created, Mark. And this is where you're creating positive messages or a positive story, a positive, narrative about the relationship, and you're communicating it with actions and words. So, if your spouse is saying, I feel like you just don't respect me, right? You can say, I would really like for you to feel respected. And so I'm going to be making some efforts to do that, right? And as you work on those home messages, it feels really good for me to understand how to respect you. It feels really good to have respect in our relationship. If you have a conversation, I'm really grateful that we handled that with some respect, right? So you're kind of bringing it back home. You're tying the action back in with the action. So yes, you need to make the changes, and you need to be, have some understanding and some follow through and some communication around those changes to really make them effective.
Yes, I would agree with that. Almost universally, though, like when this process starts, one of the things I've noticed is that a lot of our clients get a bunch of pushback from their partner.
Yeah.
Almost universally. And I think this is a part of it's a consequence of that lack of trust and change. In a lot of the cases that we've seen, there's been a lot of promise of change in the past, or that things will be better. And so here's like this other instance where, okay, yeah, you're promising to change again. And what do we get with this? We get a lot of reduced communication. We get a lot more anger or frustration, tension, arguments. We get perhaps the partner starts pushing for a divorce even more, a lot of denial or defensiveness. But this is almost to be expected in these cases where, especially if the marriage has been in crisis. For a lot of people, this can be really disheartening. They say, okay, I'm making some changes and my partner is reacting really poorly. They don't want to talk to me anymore, or that we're having more arguments, even though I'm doing better. I guess I should stop. And I do think that's not an uncommon way to think with this, but it's also a bit of a mistake. So what's really needed in this situation? If we're trying to clear this up and we're trying to get around some of the resistance, I mean, that's a whole process in and of itself, but what do you think really needs to be focused on when we're trying to make some changes and apply what needs to, when we're trying to work on this stage?
Yeah. I'm just going to reiterate a little bit what you said, though, before we dive into that. But yeah, it's really, really important that you understand that resistance is normal. In fact, it's actually our second part of our process that we're putting together. It's the second stage that we expect our clients and we actually tell them, right off the bat, we're going to do this like assessment, we're going to get some understanding. And the first thing you can expect from your spouse is resistance. They're going to shut down communication more. There might be actually more anger, more blaming, more tension, more volatility. They might move further, into actions away from you. They might deny that anything needs to be changed, right? And this is what we actually expect. And it's part of the process. So when you're getting that resistance as you're making these positive changes, that's normal. What you don't want to do is give up hope, because it is hard to make changes, right? It is hard. It is hard to do something different than what you've been doing. But we all know we have to do something different in order to see something different in our lives, right? So what's really needed to start making the change and to have it be effective, right, is to really have a clear objective on what you are changing within the relationship. And remember, we talked about pressure, right? So we don't want to do this with pressure on the relationship. And so that means that your goal should not be reconciliation. If your spouse senses that you're making these changes just to try to get them back, their resistance is only going to go up, right? So there's a way of doing this where you really make sure that it's not about getting back together, but reconciliation is a result of things changing for the better. So it's not a goal by itself. Hope that comes across really clear. So Mark, as you've worked with clients, how have you helped guide them through this? They need to make changes. They need to be communicating about those changes, but they need to do it without putting pressure on the relationship, right?
Yeah. So a lot of people who are coming to us, they're saying, oh no, my spouse is considering divorce. And they say, okay, I say, okay, well, why are you here? Like, what are you trying to accomplish? What do you want to get done? And they say, well, I want to reconcile. And I said, well, that's much like you said, that's an end result of everything. And like, if that's the only goal, the person who says, I'm done or I want out, they're just going to flat out reject that. There's reasons why people are considering divorce, and they need those reasons resolved in some way. They need all that soothed. So having a more of a clear objective to resolve those problems is a much more direct way to help calm everything down. And I think the better that you can demonstrate that that is something that's important and that you are actually making some changes there, it becomes easier to kind of consider that reconciliation. With a lot of people, that does mean that you communicate those objectives very directly or clearly. Generally, when we're talking about, like Heather mentioned, home messages, I do generally encourage a lot of communication around that. But yeah, that clear objective, clear communication, and clear action, demonstrating what you're actually saying that you're doing, are generally the three things that I think are needed to really make this a good, effective point in the process. So these three things together, the whole point of this is, it's like I said earlier, it's the beginning of a process. It's together they start building up a certain narrative within the relationship. I'm going to point out that if your relationship has gotten to this point, then a certain narrative has been building up for some time before this. And it does take effort to turn the ship around. It takes these changes being very clear with communication, being very open with communication, setting some expectations, having some follow through, but all of that, it's towards building up that next stage, that building up some trust, some assurance here. Heather, any further thoughts on that?
I do. And I love the assurance. Let's get to that. I was just looking at the comments here, and I think there's a really potential good example here. Leanne, you've been giving some comments here about how it's your anniversary. You've got no response from your husband. He's treating you like the fifth wheel. And so is this other woman that's involved. And how you mentioned that you need more positivity because there's been a lot of negativity. So this is a great example of how you can start to make some changes. You can say, I want to be happier. I'm going to be more positive. and I want to communicate more positively in this situation and do that for myself because I want to be happier and I want to learn how to have good relationships. And you're not putting pressure on the marriage. You're not saying, hey, husband, it's our anniversary and you said nothing. And why aren't you talking to me? And you should be doing these things and you should leave this other woman and you should respect me and you should stand up for me and you should defend me, right? Putting all that blame and that negative story, that negative narrative, right? So by having some clear communication on what the changes are that you're making, and you're going to say, I'm going to be positive. That is going to shift things that you're doing right now and change the narrative that you have and that he has about you and the marriage. And then as you back that up with action, you actually are positive. You are looking for the good things. That starts to create that new narrative that's going to change the direction that you're in right now and that old narrative that was built up over time. So this is exactly how we apply this in a real life situation, right? And as you do that, you're going to have more trust and confidence in yourself because you're going to feel more positive because you are being more positive. You have more positive actions, you have more positive thoughts, you have more positive words, more positive behaviors, and that starts to build a level of trust in yourself and in your spouse as well. Now let's go into assurance. So we've talked about how we have to have assessment. We need to understand what's really going on. And then we need to have some application of some changes that are communicated clearly. And then the next piece here of our 4 A's is assurance. Mark, what is assurance all about and why is it so important?
Well, we said earlier that one of the commonalities here is this lack of trust, especially any amount of hope or trust in changes. Specific, like, so it's very, very by definition, if the relationship is in a state, that assurance, that security or stability in the relationship is low. By taking some action and trying to build up some change, we're beginning that process, but it is a bit of a process. Changes can be made, but most relationships need a little bit of time. They need some assurance to come out of that crisis. And this is a lot of like what we're talking about here. Now, if I had to like boil down what specifically builds up trust, what helps people feel secure, what provides some assurance, I think at the basic level, what is this about? It's most often, like when we're talking about trust, it's predictable outcomes. Like, so Heather, if I were to turn to you and say, hey, I trust that you are going to be a good business partner, that you're not going to lie to me, like whatever it happens to be, like it's me saying, hey, I can predict certain things from you. I have some trust that those things are going to happen. And so what we try to create is that predictability around specific ideas. So clear expectations and follow through is the name of the game. So like, whereas a lot of people might go into this and start making some changes, we've talked about having very clear communication. This is just a continuance of this a little bit. It's just, like the previous stage is about setting everything up, and this is more about like working through those little problems that come up as you go through the process. A lot of times what I've noticed is that people will start making the changes, they'll communicate really well, and then their partner comes back to them and they say, it's hard for me to trust in this. And I almost see this as a separate stage, because it's, on the one hand, their partner recognizes that things are different, that something is different here. It's just the lack of trust in its continuance. So in my mind, a lot of like what needs to be done here is to acknowledge that insecurity and say, hey, that's okay. It's okay that you don't trust in this, and we're going to work through this together. I'm going to continue to do this, and let's test this out a bit. It's having some acceptance for where you're at, having a lot of communication, but it's focusing on this idea specifically is kind of what the stage is about. And I feel like I'm a little bit all over the place with the explanation. So maybe an example would be
Yeah,
good. I'm thinking of a situation where at some point in the relation, like earlier on in the relationship, before this couple came to me, there was some bit of infidelity. And the wife had just found out about this, and this had caused a lot of problems. So even though this incident was years gone, it was a fresh problem for her because it was something new. And so he knew, like, some of the changes that he had to make is he needed to be much more open and to be much more willing to be vulnerable with his wife, because the whole time he was afraid of what would happen if she found out. And when I talked with her, this is exactly what she was saying. She's like, I don't trust in this. It doesn't feel secure to me. It doesn't feel safe. She's asking me, would you stick around in a situation like this? And I said, okay, hold on. Well, it sounds like you're not trusting this, and that's okay. What we ended up working towards, we said, okay, if you're wanting to feel safe, let's work on being safe. And so that means what would help you to be safe? She told us that him being more open, him sharing more of his feelings, him sharing some things that are especially hard to share or vulnerable would help her to feel more safe. So I know this is a roundabout way of explaining all this, but essentially we were able to tackle the issue of trust more directly in that case. We were able to communicate with her what she needed to feel safe. We were, accepting that it wasn't safe right then. And I was able to help them work together towards that. Now that's an ideal situation. It may not be the same in all cases, but that's a little bit, this was my long explanation of this step.
no, it's really helpful. It brings to my mind a lot about just the narrative that your spouse has, right? And it's really understanding that they built this up, this negative belief about you, this negative story about the marriage, and they've done it over weeks, months, sometimes years, sometimes even decades worth of this quote unquote like evidence that they've built up that this is what the relationship is and this is why they're not happy, right? And so they're going to hold on to that story so strongly because it's either a defense mechanism, right? They've built up a wall to keep them from feeling pain, from getting hurt again, or it sometimes is a bit of an excuse or justification so that they don't have to feel guilty about what they're doing. So again, it's going to keep them from feeling some level of pain, right? And so when you're going through this process, sometimes they're going to be like, I don't really believe this. It doesn't feel really safe to me. I'm not really ready what they're really saying without saying it. They're never going to say this with words, but what we know is going on is I'm not ready to let go of the story. I'm not ready to let go of my defense mechanism. I'm not ready to fully commit and be vulnerable and give you my heart again, right? There's still that lack of trust in you and in the situation. And that's really normal. So when your spouse is saying, I don't really trust your changes, I don't really trust that this is going to last. It might feel like a manipulation or something like that. You've told me you changed in the past and you haven't, right? So it's really understanding that underneath that story are those root issues. And this is where we get to work through some of those root issues with communication, with action, and creating those predictable outcomes. And as you do that, it's going to help them to feel safe to let go of that negative belief or that negative narrative that they have about you and to see you for who you really are. I'm going to give a very vulnerable example in my own life. Okay. So my husband's traveling a lot right now with his new job. He's now a private pilot, flies very wealthy people all around the country. So he's gone 18 days out of the month and he's home 10. And this was a major trigger for me because in my early years, I had seen infidelity occur from people very close to me due to lots of travel outside the home. So for years, I was always like shutting down. No, you can't leave, right? I had this fear, right? That if Ben was gone a lot, he's going to be exposed to other women and other relationships. And that did not feel safe or secure to me, right? So I'd always shut down any opportunity for him to become a commercial pilot or military, different things like that. That was my wall, right? That was my belief or my story was that men that travel are unfaithful. And so after we'd already worked through a lot of layers of my own fear about him leaving me or about him being unfaithful, which was my root issue. It was not anything that he even did. Like, I brought my own junk into the relationship, right? We all do that. Your spouse has their own past trauma, you have your own, and you have your own fears and insecurities, right? It took a lot of this, this clear communication of like, okay, I feel like I've worked through a lot of my own insecurity about feeling like I'm not good enough. That root issue, that deep seated belief inside me, that deep insecurity. And we have worked together a lot on building the kind of relationship that feels good and safe to both of us, where we talk about our problems, we find healthy ways, functional ways of dealing with things, right? Working together as a team, meeting each other's needs, understanding each other, right? To the point where I was like, okay, I think I can do this. But I still required, because it was still such a trigger for me to have him gone so often, I need to be able to communicate with you. If I'm having any kind of doubt, I just need to be able to voice it and not have you get defensive about that, right? That it's not really about you. And it's not that I don't even trust you. It's just that I just have a lot of fear still about trust in general, right? It's nothing you even did. And then his action was that he would support that, right? He would let me just say, yeah, this is where I am. This is who I talked to today, right? We had that vulnerability, that transparency, and we had some predictable outcomes. And then there needed to be some healthy boundaries put in place that we could both agree upon, and have that, like, the sustained effort there of this predictable outcome. And now we're almost a year into this new lifestyle, and I do trust him, like, because we've gone through this so many times now. We've had those clear expectations. We've had follow through. We've had communication. He's been supportive and understanding that this is my big insecurity. And I've also looked at myself and be like, what do I need to do here? So this is how you can have assurance within your marriage. And it does require other steps leading up to this point, right? Like Mark said, this is a little later on in the process. It does shift the narrative or belief that you and your spouse both have around the marriage. Mark, have you seen that in your marriage, with, how important assurance is, with Jennifer?
I do think that like what you shared there, like you shared, like, hey, here's this very specific kind of weak area in your relationship. And I do think that that's the case in just about any relationship, is like we each bring in our own unique weaknesses, our own unique concerns. And sometimes that's really hard to work through. Quite often, like, so on my end, like, sometimes I have a really hard time like accepting or understanding when people are just trying to be nice to me or trying to express or share like love towards me. That's just like, it's a weaker area of mine, and I don't always notice it, or I don't always receive it. And so sometimes, like, I might go to Jen and say, hey, I'm not really feeling this right now, and she'll point out all the instances where, like, this is where she's tried to help support this, and that works for us. Like, she's able to come and challenge that, like, she's able to provide that assurance because we have had these sort of conversations a number of times, and there is that trust there. But in a lot of relationships, no matter whether they're really doing poorly or they're doing well, having that idea of assurance is kind of needed in, I think, just about any relationship. And especially if they're around those weaker areas. It just happens to be that when a marriage is in crisis, those weaker areas have been amplified quite a bit, and it just really emphasizes the need to provide that assurance to a much greater degree.
I agree. So I'm asking you guys in the chat, what might be the weaker areas in your relationship? And just being, again, having that awareness and that understanding is important. And what triggers might you have, right? And do you both have? And can you have some grace and some allowance that your spouse has their triggers and that you have your triggers, and being able to work together through those with a lot of empathy, a lot of understanding, forgiveness, compassion, empathy, right? I think I said that twice, but it's important. So I'll say it twice again, empathy, empathy. It really is. It's like, I'm trying to understand where you're coming from. My experience may be completely different from yours. My personality, my temperament type, whatever you want to call it, I might see the world completely different for than you do, but I see that for you, this is true. This is reality for you. And I can give some grace there. I can even validate what you're going through. Validation doesn't mean you have to agree with them. You can validate someone and completely disagree, and they don't even have to know it. But what you're going to do is build up that understanding and that assurance, which is the key word here right now, is that you will create that safety in the relationship. Now that leads us to the last of our 4 A's, which is accountability. And accountability is where we start really making the healing process a team effort. So like we mentioned at the beginning, it's primarily going to be you that's working on the relationship, because we're making an assumption here that your spouse is pulling away and you're the one wanting to work on the relationship. That's probably why you're listening to this podcast at all, right? Mm-hmm. And so at first, things are going to be a little more imbalanced. You're going to be the one that has to make those changes, to communicate clearly, to find out what's really going on, have that understanding. But now is where we can start to bring the relationship more into balance, where you're both working on the marriage. Mark, thoughts about accountability here and how we can navigate this successfully?
Well, I think it's, in many cases, people jump to this first. The assumption is, well, of course, everyone should jump at the chance of fixing the relationship, and that isn't always an easy place to start for people. Over and over again, I hear couples, they say, like, it's almost this tit for tat or the scorekeeping, like, well, I'm not going to go forward because they're not taking action themselves. And so usually, our approach is to just say, why don't you go first? And then it's so much easier for you to hold your partner a bit more accountable for what they need to do within the relationship. This is a lot of what we've been trying to build up. Like, I know a lot of you want to jump right to that accountability. And Heather, are you?
I have to step out just a minute. I'll be right back.
Okay, I wasn't sure if you were indicating like, let's put a pause on things, or by all means, if you need to step away, I'll just keep going. So I know a lot of you want to start here and say, okay, this is what my wife should be doing here. But that's what we've been building up to this point. If you can really take some time to understand them, if you are taking some action yourself, if you are the one really pushing for some assurance and some security in the relationship, if you are making those changes, then it becomes easy for you to say, hey, and I also want some respect here. And hey, I also want to be able to work towards some solutions, for you to expect a little bit more from them. So this is all predicated on those ideas. Like, if you've made those changes, if you've been communicating well, if you've been providing assurance. In my opinion, it's all well and good to do things on your own. And sometimes with High Thrive, we talk about save your marriage on your own. I will take a half step back from that. And I will say a lot of the process you can start on your own, but where the real healing starts to happen is where you can both be accountable to each other in the changes that need to happen. Certainly, like, even within my own marriage, it's all well and good if my wife says, hey, I'm going to make these changes for myself so things can be better, if I do that myself. But it becomes so much better when we come to each other and say, hey, look, these are some things that I really need from you. These are some things that I can offer. These are some things that I can support you in changing, so on and so forth. Now, I understand that it may not always be easy to approach your partner with that accountability, especially if they state that they are done. And often it can be easier to start small or with some agreed upon goals. Maybe the accountability here is around co-parenting, or something small like speaking respectfully to each other, or not yelling at each other, or not having arguments in front of the kids. Almost always a more basic goal like that is even well received, even in those cases where your partner is adamantly saying that they're done with the relationship. But even if all we get is that little bit where they're agreeing to speak more respectfully, that's still a win, and we're moving in the right direction, and we can start calming down some other more frightening parts of the relationship to get it to a healthier spot. So this is a lot about like, okay, how do we start approaching the relationship and asking them for some things, and in what order, and all that. And it's hard for me to outline here exactly how every relationship should go, because I think, at this point in the process, just about every relationship is different, and you really need that extra support there. I will tell you that, some of the best moments in my relationship with my wife, as odd as this sounds, are those moments where we really have sat together and said, and asked for that support and that accountability from each other. Those are those moments where I really have felt like a team, like my wife and I can do anything together, that, we can overcome any obstacle. And so if you can reach these points in a crisis, everything feels so much safer, better, healthier. But you need to build to that. And that's what we've been saying here. All right. I'm not sure where Heather has gone to, and that's fine. We're going to move on and wrap up with our marriage mythbuster. So this week, the myth is happy marriages happen naturally. Now, remember, we always take these myths from comments, from client experiences. These are always things that we find out in the wild, so to speak. So it's always interesting to kind of take some perspectives that we see out there and kind of give a quick analysis on that. But this, like I said, this time we're looking at happy marriages happen naturally. And I will say that this is absolutely false. I think that marriages or relationships can be happy naturally for a time. Absolutely. I can think back to like early days of my marriage, first year or so. There really wasn't a whole lot that my wife Jen and I had to deal with. Everything was just happy, and it felt easy for things to be happy. And so I'm going to say that marriages can be happy without a lot of effort sometimes, but mostly only until a major life change happens. And this is quite frequently when that naturally part starts to fall apart. Usual causes for some trouble: kids, career changes, financial hardship, loss, extramarital attention. These are all things that generally require some amount of attention or some amount of shift in order to accommodate these changes. Now, obviously, something like an extramarital attention, an affair, is a big deal. That's not just an accommodation, but like you do need to address these things. But almost, like universally, over the course of a long-term relationship, something's going to change. Now, I don't know where I heard this, but I've heard that each person is a different person individually every 10 years or so. Like you're a completely different person every 10 years. People change, and the relationships need to be able to adapt with the individuals. The couple together, the relationship together needs to adapt to the changes of the individuals. Otherwise, you will have that drop in happiness, that drop in satisfaction. And the problems come up when couples don't properly work through these changes. That friction then builds, and then problems aren't resolved. So the idea that the marriage just happens naturally, that you don't need to do anything or nothing difficult or uncomfortable, is, in my mind, such a fantasy. It's such an alluring fantasy, even, so as to to really create some disappointment when there does need to be a little bit of effort to maintain things. Now, if you are taking if you are taking that effort to maintain the relationship on a regular basis, then it may not seem like such a difficult thing to go through. And that's maybe a little bit where this comes from. Anyways, Heather, I was just wrapping up with the marriage myth buster. Do you have any final thoughts there? I don't know how much that you caught.
No, it's good. But I just gonna, preface that, or whatever, not preface. This is the end. So not preface. I'm gonna just say that marriage, love is a choice and happiness is a choice. And if you're constantly looking for people, your spouse or circumstances outside of yourself to make you happy, you will never be happy. But it's a choice. And again, watch out for those challenges that are going to come, because they're going to come to all of us. And it's really about learning how to create a healthy and functional relationship. And that is something that everyone can learn, regardless of your past trauma, your spouse's past trauma, any of the challenges that you might be facing. We're talking about like marriage miracle, right? Things that might seem hopeless, that might seem like there isn't any way for them to possibly turn around. It might feel like your spouse is calling all the shots here and that you have no power. But the truth is that you have more power than you realize. And that when you start to do some things in a new way, you are going to get new results. So leave a comment. Let us know which of these 4 A's stood out to you the most. And if you need more help with your marriage comment path, so we can get you in our path course before we close doors in 2 days from now. Again, there's only 100 spots open for that. And that's the exact 4-step process to save your marriage from divorce. So marriage is worth it. It's worth it. It's worth the work and the effort that you put into it, because it's one of the most intimate and joyous relationships that we can create. So we can transform the pain that you're in right now into joy. And we have been able to see that happen for countless clients' lives. And it is incredible to witness. So thank you so much for sharing this, Mark. Thank you for sharing your insight and your wisdom and these principles that have changed so many people's lives. Next week, we're going to share with you hope versus action, the ultimate showdown to save your marriage. So if you're feeling hopeless, we're going to show you what to do about that and how to turn things around fast. So thank you guys for joining us today, and we can't wait to see your marriage thrive.